Thank you for downloading from Digital Mindfulness. This is episode number 44. Hello and welcome to the show. My guest this week is the entrepreneur and New York Times best-selling author Martin Ford. Martin is the author of the 2015 FT and McKinsey Business Book of the Year winner, Rise of the Robots, Technology and the Threat of a Jobless Future. In our talk today, Martin talks about the possible future of work and the possible risk of digital automation to all of our jobs. I hope you enjoy this episode with Martin Ford. So, Martin Ford, welcome to Digital Mindfulness. Thank you so much for sparing the time to just come on and speak with us today. We're really pleased to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, Martin, just could you start, just by way of introduction, just by introducing yourself to the audience? What was your journey to working so closely on technological unemployment and also the increase in automation in our daily lives?
Well, I've run a small software business out in Silicon Valley for many years now, and I saw in my own little business how technology was having an impact. It used to be that software was shipped on CD-ROMs and there was a manual and it all had to be put in a box and shipped physically to a customer. And of course, that was a lot of work for typical people. But it didn't take long before all of that kind of evaporated. And now, of course, software is delivered electronically. So I sort of saw that myself, and that's what really started me thinking about this. And back in 2009, I wrote my first book. It was a self-published book on this subject, and then that led to an opportunity to write my more recent book. So it's become an issue that I've become more and more interested in part as I've thought about it and realized the implications of technology, and in part as I've seen the impact in my own business.
That's incredible. And so I guess with that, then, I mean, how did the first book do? Like you said, you self-published that, and I'm assuming that the ideas that you had in the book were quite new to the market.
Well, in a sense, yes. I mean, at least at this time, it was new. Although the idea that technology could create unemployment is an old idea. It goes all the way back to the Luddites. And there have been many people who have raised that concern. But the thing is that it's always turned out to be a false alarm. And that's part of the reason that people are very skeptical of this. So when I wrote the book in 2009, it was, I guess, the first time in a while, at least, that this issue had been addressed, but certainly not the first time ever. But I do think, my entire premise is that we are finally entering a time when the technology is now there, that this is going to be a real concern, even though in the past it has, in fact, come up lots of times, and it was raised, I think, prematurely.
So let's now move on to your actual book, The Rise of the Robots, because this is the book subsequent to your 2009 book. So can you tell us about it? You've spoken briefly about this, but what is the main idea behind The Rise of the Robots?
Well, the main central idea of the book is that technology is going to displace work and that ultimately we could run into unemployment. And the key factor is that machines, robots, and algorithms are getting better and better at doing anything that is on some level routine, repetitive, and predictable. And then I guess the technology more than anything that's really driving this is machine learning. This is the ability of algorithms to look through data, and based on that, they can learn. They can, and in many cases, they can learn to do tasks. Now, the reality is that a lot of people in our workforce come to work and they do the same kinds of things again and again, either every day or every month. It may be someone stocking a store shelf, doing the same thing again and again. It may be someone flipping hamburgers, or it might be a white collar person who cranks out the same report again and again. All of that kind of work is ultimately going to be susceptible to this. So it's a very broad-based thing that scales across industries and occupations and also across skill levels. So lots and lots of people, maybe something on the order of half of the people in the workforce are likely to be impacted by this.
So you just very quickly brushed over that at the end, but you said like half the workforce.
That's just a rough guess on my part, but I think that most of us have the sense that there are a lot of people out there that basically do routine things. I mean, one way to approach that is to ask yourself, could another person study a record of everything that has been done in a particular job in the past, and based on studying that historical record, could another person figure out how to do that job? And if they could, then probably someday there'll be an algorithm that'll do that same basic thing. So, that gives you a sense of just how many jobs out there. It's a lot of jobs that could ultimately be susceptible to this.
So, and I know you've been asked this question a lot, but just again for the benefit of our audience, why is this particular time and this particular technology revolution so much more concerning from the perspective of the workplace and employment than the other revolutions that came before it?
Well, the other revolutions were primarily mechanical in nature. What we have now is kind of what you might call a cognitive revolution. We've got machines that are beginning, in a limited way at least, to think. They are taking on cognitive capability, which means that they're beginning to encroach on that thing that is really fundamental to human beings, that really sets us apart from everything else on this planet. And machines are getting better and better in that, and they're relative to many workers, they're going to begin to encroach on what those people are capable of. So it's that revolution where machines are beginning to think, together with the fact that it's so ubiquitous. Technology is, information technology is becoming almost like a utility now. It's just everywhere. It's almost like electricity. It's being applied in every single industry, every single business, every occupation, every sector of the economy is being transformed by information technology. So it's not specific to one area of the economy in the way that, for example, farm machinery was specific to agriculture. Information technology is something that's going to just scale across the entire economy. And that's really what's different, is that it's coming for everything.
Because you wrote in the book that we ought to be concerned about this, because robots and technology in general, that we shouldn't really consider them as tools anymore, but now they're workers. And I thought that was a fascinating sentence right there. But why should we be concerned about this now that they're becoming workers? I mean, surely machines and software just do what humans tell them to do.
Well, the point is that relative to many workers, I mean, machines are going through a transition, I think, where there were clearly tools used by those workers that made the workers more valuable. And as a result, the workers got higher wages. I mean, that's what we saw, for example, from the end of World War II up until the mid-1970s. But beyond that point, at least in the United States, and I think to some extent in the UK, wages have stagnated for many workers. Not getting a raise at all. And I think that part of the reason that's causing that is that machines are going through this transition. So that's not necessarily in and of itself a bad thing, but it creates a social issue and a political issue and an economic issue that we're going to have to struggle with. If many workers are going to become disenfranchised, if they simply don't have skills to offer in the workplace because machines increasingly can do just about everything that they can do, then we've got to figure out a solution to that, right?
Is this being spoken about seriously in political circles and indeed in enterprise circles?
Well, I go around giving a lot of talks about this, and there are audiences that are very interested. For the most part, they're, trade shows and events and corporate events, and people are very interested in it and beginning to talk about it. So it is getting some visibility. For the most part, politicians are not really focused on it yet. There are some exceptions to that. Like I've gone to the Netherlands, for example, and their government ministry is quite interested in this question. But they're fairly far ahead of most other countries, I think. So I think that this is something that's just kind of beginning to get onto the radar now. There's the public discussion and certainly some academic discussion of it. But it hasn't really entered the political sphere yet. I think that eventually that will happen as people become more aware of what's happening.
Because, the reason I ask whether it's being taken seriously in political circles is that, the Financial Times and McKinsey to huge corporations, and they took the book very seriously. I'm wondering why you think that political influencers aren't taking this more seriously, or that why they're not kind of saying, right, we need to be thinking about this, and we need to be kind of we need to be thinking about skills and education. We need to be thinking about how we're going to help people.
Well, as you say, the media has certainly given a lot of attention to this. And so there is increasing visibility. I'm just saying that it has. I don't really hear politicians talking about this. And part of the reason is I think that there are no easy answers to it. It's a very toxic issue politically. It's not something that they're going to want to talk about unless they have to, I would guess, because one of the things I point out in the book is that this really kind of defies conventional solutions. If the machines are beginning to think, then one of the things that implies is that just re-educating people, especially people that are now doing working class type jobs, is not necessarily going to be a viable solution. We may need something more radical than that, and I think that's an area that politicians aren't ready to delve into. So the other thing is that it's much easier to point to other causes like global trade or immigration and so forth. Certainly in the U.S., if you look at what's happening with people like Donald Trump, that's where the focus is right now. It's much easier to point your finger at other people than it is to talk about some intangible force like advancing technology. But I do think that we see a lot of political upheaval, certainly both in Europe and in the U.S., and this is a big part of what's causing that. The impact on the job market and on the incomes of a lot of people is one of the forces that's leading to, the rise of people like Trump and so forth.
So how would you frame what you've just said in the realm of, say, work in developing countries? Because if you have governments there that are willing to import algorithms and software and technology to help them develop, then it's going to be very much like you said in your book. There's going to be a lot more wealth, but in terms of employment, there's going to be a lot of stagnation as companies and countries overlook the human capital that they have.
Yeah, and that's happening. China is now by far the biggest market in the world for industrial, factory robots, for example. They're automating very rapidly. And they're doing it because they want to remain competitive, because if they don't do that, then what's going to happen is either the factories are going to reshore, they're going to go back to the U.S. or to Europe so that they can build automated factories closer to markets, or maybe they're going to migrate to even lower wage countries like Vietnam or Indonesia. So that's happening. It will impact employment. So this is a global force. It's going to impact different countries in different ways. If you look at a country like the UK or the US, they're mostly service economy countries. Manufacturing is not very big in terms of employment anymore. So the biggest impact that's going to happen there is when robots and automation come to the service sector, things like retail and white collar jobs. Whereas in China and in other developing countries, actual factory robots are going to have an enormous impact. So this is something that different countries are going to have to struggle with in different ways, but it's really a global force that's going to impact everywhere.
So how long then do you expect to see the ideas in your book being implemented? Like, do you think it will be in the next year or the next decade?
Well, every day almost I see news that supports the general thesis that artificial intelligence and robots are rapidly progressing. In terms of, when is this really going to be something that we just can't ignore, that it becomes kind of obvious to everyone what's happening and, people demand some sort of a solution. I tend to think in terms of a 10, 15, 20-year time frame, but that's really just a guess on my part. And I think it's a fairly conservative guess. It could well be before then. I certainly know a lot of people involved in these technologies who think it could happen within, say, 5 to 10 years, that this becomes really just a relentless force that people really begin to notice. So there's a lot of uncertainty with when exactly does this arrive in terms of a big issue that can't be ignored anymore. But I do think that day is certainly coming.
You spoke very briefly about the types of industries that will be affected by this, and I was just wondering if you could go into a little bit more detail about that and just give some examples.
Right. I mean, the short answer to that is every industry, because again, this is a general purpose technology, and it takes the form of physical robots as well as smart algorithms. Every single industry is going to be impacted by this, and nearly every type of work. But some areas that is certainly, I mean, everyone by now is familiar with self-driving cars. I mean, that's going to have an enormous impact on people that drive for a living, and it's also going to have a huge peripheral impact on anyone else that is in an industry that relies on the fact that we all own and drive our own cars. All of that is ripe to be disrupted at some point. So there are millions and millions of jobs and businesses there. Other jobs, like, for example, fast food, preparing hamburgers and coffee and all of that is, I think, very likely to be much further automated in the relatively near future. Retail jobs working in stores, or shops. You're going to see actual robots in those environments that can do things like stock shelves. You will see people bringing their mobile technology, their phones, into the store and getting assistance. They won't have to talk to a person. They'll just be able to talk to their phone and get assistance. And then across the board in white collar jobs, any kind of white collar work. I mean, we see examples already. Systems that can do basic journalism, smart systems that are able to tap into a source of data and then figure out what's interesting about that data, and then write a news story. And you can read that news story, and it won't be obvious that it was written by a machine and not a person. Some areas of law are being automated, where lawyers used to have to review documents and so forth. That's already being automated. Areas of medicine, like, for example, radiology, where doctors look at medical images and figure out, is there a tumor there? A lot of that is going to be automated, I think, in the near future. So there are many, many jobs that are done by people that have education. And in general, I think that where this is heading is that any kind of routine white-collar job where you're sitting in front of a computer and you're doing something that's routine and predictable, like writing the same kind of report again and again, or the same type of analysis, all of that is going to be susceptible. And that this is a huge number of jobs, and it's not just jobs that are done by people who don't have much education, which is always kind of the conventional view of this. This is jobs done by people that went to university and got their university degree, and maybe even went beyond that, went to graduate school. So, that this is a big issue for us.
Because this was the prevailing wisdom, wasn't it, amongst people who would be working white collar jobs, that it would be people kind of working in, I don't know, fast food stores or in areas like that would be susceptible to automation, technological unemployment. But for these people who have, like you were mentioning, lawyers and solicitors and radiologists, these people who have spent a long time training for their positions, like, surely they won't be put out of work by a machine.
Right. I mean, the conventional assumption has always been that the future kind of belongs to the knowledge worker, right? The person that, rather than working with their hands, they work with knowledge and information. That person is supposedly going to benefit from all of these advantages, and those are the persons that are really going to thrive in this new economy. But and that has basically been true in the early stages of the computer age. The question is that going to continue to be true? And I think that in many cases it won't be. And the fact of the matter is that to automate a knowledge job, which just involves manipulating information, is lots of times easier and cheaper than automating a blue-collar job where a person is physically manipulating the environment. And the reason is that to automate that blue-collar job, you got to really build an expensive mechanical robot. You need things like machine vision and the ability to have hand-eye coordination, which is still really difficult challenges for a machine. On the other hand, in the knowledge area, it's just data. It's algorithms churning through data, cranking out answers. A lot of that is actually easier to automate.
Martin, I'm curious, what type of effects have you seen this increasing digitization on people, particularly, like you say, knowledge workers, because we're always told that, disruption and digital disruption is new. It's not this new, but that it's fantastic, and this is the thing that companies should be aiming for and look at the future that this is ushering in. But I would imagine that kind of working with this shadow looming, that increasingly sophisticated algorithms or robots could potentially be taking my job, and that I'm constantly going to have to upskill myself. It feels to me quite stressful, and I'm wondering if that's something that you found.
In some cases, yes. I mean, I think people are definitely becoming aware of this, and there is some level of concern out there. It's both people that are in existing jobs that see the advance of technology and the potential for that, and it's also younger people that are trying to get on the career track, maybe even looking for their first job. One thing we see, especially in the U.S., is that up to half of university graduates are actually not finding jobs that really utilize that education. You have a lot of people graduating from university and they end up working at Starbucks. And if you look at wages for university graduates in the United States, they've actually gone over the past decade. They've actually declined in real terms. So, it's still much better to get that more advanced degree than to stop at secondary school. But still, things are not fantastic just because people do get that university degree. Many people are really struggling to find opportunities. So I do think that this is part of what's causing that. So yeah, there's a lot of concern about there among workers, among college or university students, and also among parents. Who are worried about their older kids that are entering this job market. So it is something that is definitely going to put a lot of stress and concern on people. And I expect that to increase as this trend continues to accelerate and all of this becomes more obvious.
Great. Which industries do you think will not be affected by this, or perhaps have a protracted effect over longer term?
There are some that are going to be more resistant to it. And the two that we see that so far have been more resistant to it are education and healthcare. You see a lot of initiatives with online education and so forth. There are certainly technologies out there. There are robotic tutors that can help students and so forth. And so there's a lot of advance there. So perhaps the disruption is going to come to education, but so far we don't see it. Certainly if you look at productivity in education, it hasn't increased the way it has in manufacturing, for example. So far the technology has not really disrupted that sector. And that's probably even more true of healthcare. Most countries, especially in the United States, we've got rising healthcare costs, and technology has so far not been able to, to disrupt that sector. And a lot of it, again, is that healthcare is very dependent on very skilled workers that do jobs that in many cases are very hard to automate. For example, nursing, where you've got a nurse that works with patients. It requires an incredible amount of dexterity, mobility, direct interaction, physical and psychological, with patients, as well as problem solving. I mean, all of those qualities put together in one package, is still not something that we can build a robot to do. I mean, that would be science fiction. So there are a lot of jobs like that in healthcare that really aren't very susceptible to this. There are certain areas where we see plenty of potential for automation. For example, radiology and pathology, those types of medicine where it's really about information, as well as areas like pharmacy, preparing medicines. Those kind of more routine mechanical work is also very susceptible to automation. But in general, I think education and healthcare are areas there where there's tremendous potential for technology to have an impact, and I think that eventually it will happen, but it's going to be a little bit slower than in some other areas of the economy.
I just want to go a little bit deeper into this because I think that this is fascinating, because education and healthcare in particular, these are two areas which, I don't know, they necessitate like one-to-one human contacts more often than not. And it seems that the type of education that you're speaking about is not necessarily information dissemination, more like the coaching, like coaching children or adults or whatever, but coaching people to get the best result. And certainly with healthcare and nursing, that's very much one-to-one. It's very much, human-to-human contacts. Would you agree with that? It's the human element.
But again, technology is getting better at that. Like I said, there are automated systems used in education that can give personalized attention to students, systems that can monitor their progress and offer them specific help. Those kinds of technologies are getting better. So again, we haven't seen the disruption yet in education, but it's certainly possible. I think that I would say in the near term, education is more likely to be disrupted than healthcare. It's probably a somewhat lower hurdle. So I do expect to see more progress there.
Would you say, Martin, that this is a design flaw, that the ideas in your book are brought about basically a design flaw, in that the technologies that are being built are striving for convenience and speed and not necessarily for improving humanity?
Well, I don't know if it's a design flaw. I mean, that's integral to capitalism. The technology is being used to make things more efficient and very often to eliminate workers. I mean, that has been the story since the beginning of at least since the Industrial Revolution. The thing that's different is that that's going to just move much faster, and it's going to have a much more disruptive impact. And again, the reason is that the machines are finally beginning to push into intellectual cognitive areas and not just make workers mechanically more efficient, but actually take on actual intellectual tasks, and in many places displace them completely. So it's just kind of an extension and an extrapolation of what we've seen previously. And I think that the solution is not to want to stop this or think that it's wrong. It's just the natural evolution of things. But we are going to have to adapt to it economically and socially.
Sure. You're a proponent of the idea of basically paying people minimum basic income, which I know is being quite controversial in some countries. And I was wondering if you can just explain very quickly what the minimum basic income is and how that would work.
Well, the basic idea is that you give everyone at least a minimal income, whether they're able to find a traditional job or not. So everyone in society would have sort of an income floor. And the hope is that it would be properly designed in a way that would not destroy the incentive to work. So you're not going to turn everyone into a slacker who just sits around and does nothing. What you are going to do is give people an income floor and maintain the incentive for everyone to be as productive as possible, so that hopefully most people would work to the extent they could if they can find a job, or work part-time or whatever, or perhaps start a business. There's evidence to suggest that if you give people sort of a basic safety net that they can rely on, then they may well be willing to take on more risks. So you may actually see in some ways a more dynamic entrepreneurial economy where people are, for example, willing to leave a very safe job where they aren't growing and where they're bored, for example, and do something more dynamic. Maybe take another job at a smaller company, or perhaps even try to start their own business. They might be more willing to take that risk if they know they have an income safety net. So, if you design this program in an appropriate way, it can, I think, be a very positive thing. And there have been some experiments done in countries in the U.S. quite a while ago, in India more recently, that have really shown positive results. Now, in terms of what's happening with automation, there are two reasons that we want to do this. One is that we're ultimately, I think, going to run into a problem where we either have outright unemployment, where people literally can't find jobs because there aren't enough jobs, or wages are driven down by competition to the point where people really are struggling to survive. And we see that already in the U.S. in some segments of the population. And so the idea of a guaranteed income is to solve that problem, and also to make sure that we have consumers out there. One of the issues with this is that if we really get into a point where this has a big disruptive impact and creates lots of unemployment, then we don't have people out there who can buy the products and services being produced, right? And then we run the risk of kind of getting into a downward economic spiral where there just aren't enough consumers to buy what's being produced, and there's not sufficient demand in the economy. So a guaranteed income, basic income, is one way to also help address that problem, to make sure that we have a mechanism that gets purchasing power into the hands of consumers so that they can go out and buy things and drive the economy.
Sure. So I guess the biggest question that everyone would like me to ask is, what do you think people can do to protect themselves against this coming potential future?
Well, there are two levels to that. The first one is, what should I do as an individual to try to stay ahead of this? And, the conventional answer to that is that the last thing you want to do is make a big investment in training for something that's routine and repetitive. So don't go to university and study some field that involves going to work and doing the same kind of thing again and again, because you're making an investment in a type of job that's very likely to disappear. You want to emphasize creativity. You want to be engaged in an occupation where you're creating something new. And for the foreseeable future, those types of jobs that involve genuine creativity, or areas, as I said, in healthcare, where you've got lots of mobility, dexterity, and also that interpersonal reaction, those are likely to be safe for the foreseeable future. So those are the best jobs. The last thing you want is something where you just sit at a desk and do the same thing again and again, or that type of routine, repetitive work. So those are the kinds of occupations that you want to focus on as an individual. But I think it's also really important, and this is my purpose in talking about this, is that all of us as a society recognize what's happening. I think ultimately it's not just about people as individuals trying to stay ahead of this. We're going to have to do something as a society, politically, to address this issue for everyone, because obviously not everyone is going to succeed in making this transition into some new occupation that is protected. So we do need to be aware of what's happening, and begin to have that discussion so that we can eventually design a solution, perhaps something like a guaranteed income, that will work for everyone.
What do you think are the most important human qualities in the digital age, given what we've just spoken about, and how do you think we can cultivate those?
Well, in terms of the job market, I think the ability to interact with other people and understand other people and have empathy, these are things that people are good at, that right now machines are not good at, although that could change. And the second thing is creativity, the ability to generate new ideas. This is, again, something that machines so far are not capable of doing, although there's in both of these areas there is ongoing research. So we can never say never. The day may come when if you've got a problem and you need to talk to someone, you may sit down with a machine, and the machine may be more effective than a human being. But we're not at that point yet, and I think it will be quite a while before that's the case. So you want to emphasize things that really involve interacting with other people and generating new ideas. I think those are the things that people are likely to excel at least over the next couple of decades.
Martin, unfortunately, we've come to the end of the interview. Where can people find out more about you and your work?
Well, I'm on Twitter. My Twitter handle is mfordfuture, and that's probably the best place. And if you visit that, you can also find links to my book, and I've also got a blog and so forth with lots of links there. So that's probably the best place to look. mFord Future.
mFord Future. Brilliant. I'll make links to that in the show notes. But Martin Ford, thank you so much for spending time with us today on Digital Mindfulness. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.